was in a master class of uncertainty, how to master uncertainty, handle it, and how to mishandle it. So when I feel uncertain, because of my upbringing, because of my emotional source code, uncertainty means danger. Uncertainty means problems. Uncertainty means exclusion. I won't have the opportunity. And so if uncertainty is bad, you're going to operate very differently than if uncertainty means possibility. We're talking about how to excel when uncertainty strikes, how to create the exceptional. It's having the mind power, to have control, inner power, so that you can be confident. That's a very different mindset.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. Here, every episode is more than a conversation. It's a gateway into the ideas that define our reality. It's not just a podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. In a world draped with uncertainty, mastery comes not from mere resilience, but through profound understanding of what we call the metagame. Today, we uncover the art and science of turning chaos into strategy with Dr. Steven Feinberg, whose insights reframe our understanding of leadership in turbulent times. Leaders aren't just born, they are forged in the crucible of unpredictability, where they learn to discern the patterns hidden in plain sight. At least that's according to our guest today. These visionaries don't just play the game, they redefine it. Our guest calls these individuals first adapters, those rare strategists who transform potential pitfalls into pivotal turning points with agility and insight. In other words, they do what others say can't be done. Each episode of the Dov Baron Show features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. The next two episodes are no exception. Our special guest stories and insights will captivate and inspire you. So please hit that subscribe button now and become part of our global community today. Our guest today is Dr. Steven Feinberg, acclaimed author of Do What Others Say Can't Be Done, and he unveils the neuroscience behind decision-making and influence. Steven is the leading authority on neurostrategy, the field of brains, games, and foes. He's been an advisor behind many game-changing leaders, including very high-level entrepreneurs, for more than 35 years, and he's worked with organizations like Apple, Google, and Visa. He uncovers the blueprint that allows you and other greatest leaders to go beyond the chaos and seize control of your destiny. Today, we decode the hidden mechanisms of the mind that empower you to navigate the game board of your life and your enterprise. This is your opportunity to take the next step towards mastering your metagame. So please, turn up the volume, open your heart, open your mind, and begin to understand how to master your game and defeat uncertainty. Please welcome Dr. Steven Feinberg. Welcome, Steven.
Hey, Dov. Whenever I get introduced, I sit back and I listen to the introduction. And as I listen to the introduction, I think, wow, that sounds very impressive. That's really cool. I'm 73 years old. Wow, I'd like to meet that person. That's interesting. And then I go, oh, that's me. But really what I hear on the inside is my dad talking to me. He said, go for it, and basically let him know you were here.
Where I always like to start the show is with the emotional source code of that individual. You and I have had many conversations outside of this recording, of course, and my work is based on the emotional source code, and it's this understanding of how we were forged in the beginning. It doesn't necessarily mean how we will interpret that may be very different. That's why I always say children of the same parents are often born into different families because we interpret it differently. So when we think about the emotional source code of you, there's a lot there. You and I have talked a lot about that. And you talk about growing up on a fire escape. Tell us what that means.
So I did grow up on a fire escape off of Delancey Street in New York City, Lower East Side of Manhattan. The reason I was there was my family didn't have enough money at the time. We moved back in with my grandparents. So we actually were in like a railroad car apartment. And in those apartments, that's where a lot of my emotional source code, as you would call it, was formed. Actually, I went back there a few years ago, and the building is now razed to the ground. It was 135 Delancey Street, razed to the ground. But just a block away is the Jewish Tenement Museum. It's the exact replica of the building I grew up in, including the fire escape.
So tell us about what you mean by growing up on a fire escape or living on the fire escape. What does that mean?
It means that's where they put me. There wasn't enough rooms in the apartment for everyone. So if I wasn't sleeping with my grandparents, there wasn't enough rooms for my grandparents. It was a 6-story building. They would be with other members of the family. And I was there for the first 5 years, 6 years of my life. But I never knew that I was poor. My wife always says, Stevie, you have to tell everyone that they took you in during the cold and rainy. I said, of course they took me in. I was really loved. They were either family or family friends. I was a young kid, and I thought that's where I belonged. It was a great feeling. I also grew up with a great deal of uncertainty, where the stakes were always high.
You said earlier you felt loved. You were living on the fire escape, which was really another bedroom for this kid. Like you and I talked about this before. You don't know you're poor until something gives you some level of perspective and you go, oh shit, we're poor. And you suddenly realize that because this is how we live. Normal is whatever you get used to. But you're living on this fire escape and the world you live in, we have to paint a picture here because you said you're 73 years old, but it's a very different world. That's the early 50s, I guess. New York at that time is different than the New York we know now. You said it was a time of great uncertainty. Is that true about society at that time, or is that true about your reality? So tell us about why it was so uncertain.
Have you ever felt like you were caught in a hidden game? The unseen forces decided who wins and who loses, and you're left struggling to understand the rules. So picture this. On one crisp Sunday afternoon in the 60s, I was sitting on the edge of the couch with my dad, and we're watching a football game. We're watching the New York Giants play, and they're down by 2 points, and there's 5 seconds left. My whole heart is in coming back and winning because they drove the ball down to the 20. They take the timeout. The field goal kickers come onto the field. If they make the kick, they win. If they miss it, they lose. Everything is riding on this kick. The ball is hiked, and just as they hike it, my dad jumps up in front of the TV to pretend he's blocking the field goal, and he goes, miss it, miss it, miss it. And I look in real quickly, confused, but the kick is up. It's good. The Giants win. I'm really happy. I'm feeling joy. And I look at my dad, and he doesn't have the look of joy on his face. So why would he root against my team, our team? It didn't make any sense, but my answer can maybe clarify if I first state that my dad was a good man, but he didn't want me to go into the family business. You see, he was a big-time bookie and not the type that reads books. For people who don't know, bookies set the odds and take bets. He wasn't in the mob, but we could say that he was mob adjacent. So when the Giants won that game, my dad lost 10 large. That's $10,000, about $100,000 in today's currency. The average income around in that time was about $7,000 a year. So you can imagine the level of intensity that I lived in. And that's what I mean by uncertainty. The money came in and the money went out. But by the end of the day, he won it all back. And then he won more, 24/7. Growing up in that intensity, the unstable environment, the economic environment, well, I felt out of control.
That's really interesting because it's a wonderful parallel metaphor for being an entrepreneur or being in business, because you can have this amazing, insane deal go on where there's a ton of money come in, and then suddenly something you've never predicted happens, and all that goes away, and with it goes your dream, and you're completely crashed, and then out of nowhere something else can happen that can take you up or even further down. It's really interesting to me that this environment of living with this emotional roller coaster of your own stability is a parallel to the work that you ended up doing with companies and with leaders. So how do you guide them around these emotional roller coasters that are inevitable as part of those roles?
Well, when that event happened, I was faced with a heart-wrenching decision. Should I root for my dad at a financial stakes or my own heartfelt home team that I loved? And that disrupted my inner stability. Psychologists have suggested that was my innocence lost. But while I found a way to be true to my heart and without opposing my dad, the real lesson wasn't about winning or losing on the sports field. And it wasn't about choosing sides. I love to win. But the real lesson was when uncertainty strikes, you have to dig deeper, go behind the scenes to understand the hidden dynamics of the game. The metagame, it's a different type of game, a game of interactions. So what did my dad's actions mean? What did my actions mean? Who's keeping score? What's the scoreboard? What game really matters was what things meant, what was meaningful. So meaning matters there. And I began to realize that what I knew wasn't the whole story on the surface. And I had to connect the dot and see beyond the obvious to a deeper hidden pattern of games. You asked about what can a bookie teach an entrepreneur or a leader. This is not about gambling secrets, but it's a rare behind-the-scenes view of how to excel in high-stakes challenges. Looking back, what I realized was I was in a master class of uncertainty, how to master uncertainty, handle it, and how to mishandle it. So oftentimes I ask my clients, are you handling, mishandling, or excelling in this uncertainty?
So let's just put a pause there for a moment, because if you ask somebody, are you handling, mishandling, or excelling in this uncertainty, this chaos, there is not too many people who are willing to say, I'm mishandling it. There is a tendency, I would say, for people to blame the circumstance. I'm not mishandling it. It's a terrible situation, and so I'm handling it. And maybe that's true, but they're not usually excelling at it. And at that point, when the trauma of whatever this event is, whether it's a global economic situation or a personal health issue or whatever it might be, when that's happening, that person is often in the amygdala. They're in that fight, flight, freeze part of their own brain. And you're talking about this meta game, which seems to be much more cognitive and out of that part of their brain. So if they're in that state of being fight, flight, fear, oh my God, reactive, how do we get into that space of being able to have this masterful understanding of how to deal with the uncertainty when that part of our brain is going, my hair's on fire?
I love that question. And the reason why I love it is my book, Do What Others Say Can't Be Done. I started it by asking people one question. What's your number one foe? What are you up against? I figured they'd tell me fear. And I was surprised when they told me a more nuanced thing, that there was like a triple-headed dragon. And the triple-headed dragon was when they receive criticism, which triggers that amygdala. The criticism, it's judgment. All this judgment that you have, that you're not doing it well enough, not good enough. The second was being mediocre or playing small. They start to play small. They're walking on eggshells, getting out of their familiar zone, which was the third element. A lot of people talk about the comfort zone. I talk about familiarity. When you get scared, it's because things are not familiar. When things are familiar, you can handle them. So these examples of uncertainty is because of all this unfamiliarity. That ability is really what makes the difference in terms of being able to be resourceful in those contexts. When I work with people, I'm asking them questions about how they're dealing with that emotional state, the hidden game, that game of patterns they're stuck inside of. Basically, it's a set of rules about uncertainty.
This is the way you start the book. The assumptions about uncertainty. I thought that was a really great question. Assumptions about uncertainty, because I think most people would go, oh, I don't have any assumptions because it's uncertain. But I really get where you're coming from. Explain that to us, because we really need to grasp that. I think is a profound way to sort of leap off into this.
So when I feel uncertain, because of my upbringing, because of my, as you would say, my emotional source code, uncertainty means danger. Uncertainty means problems. Uncertainty means exclusion. I won't have the opportunity. Uncertainty means it's a problem, becomes a rule in my head. Where I go to, rules guide us, the internal rules that we have. And so if uncertainty is bad, you're going to operate very differently than if uncertainty means possibility. So when certainty means possibility, then you can begin to sort for evidence that there's possible ways that things can work out for even better. One of the things that my dad taught me was he'd come up against these situations. He wasn't just a gambler or a bookie. He was an entrepreneur and he had lots of businesses. But one of the things he always acted, what I saw was there's always a way, meaning you come up against this, encounter this uncertainty, this difficulty, and he finds a way forward. And that's a very different stance than playing small. Because some people go, well, I found my way forward. I just took myself off the game board. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how to excel when uncertainty strikes, how to create the exceptional. So it's not just playing small or playing status quo or staying within the familiar. It's playing big. It's having the mind power, have control, inner power, so that you can be confident and to look forward to. When my dad told me, let him know you were here, that's a very different mindset. When I go into difficult situations, I get nervous because that old program is just running its course. I'm in trouble. Just springs forward. Where the heck did that come from? And then I remember my dad told, let him know you were here, because purpose, like wanting to create something and deliver something and bring advanced civilization, is a big deal to overcome those negative emotional states.
Okay, so we all have our own responses to uncertainty. We all have a meaning we give to uncertainty. And your work is about helping us to understand that uncertainty is potentially an opportunity rather than a threat. Is that correct?
Right. Because there's usually a trigger. The trigger is something is outside what's familiar. That feeling at that moment when things are not familiar, or something is different, or something is an exception to the rule that you expect, you start feeling your emotional state starts to inform your brain. And if you're outside the familiar, it means danger. And you just get hijacked. We talk about the amygdala hijack. It grabs itself and goes. And what we want is then to replace it. The replacement behavior is with going, it's possible.
But where I want to go to, Stephen, and what I want to address directly as a pushback is, isn't this just positive thinking around something that seems negative?
I'm not a big fan of positive thinking. I see nothing wrong with being optimistic, but this is about powerful thinking.
So tell us the difference, because that's a nuance, and I think the world is made of nuance rather than black and white. So this is positive thinking. No, it's not. No, this is power thinking. What is that nuance of power thinking versus positive thinking?
So, for example, a first adapter is someone who is not a first responder. It's not an early adopter of something. You usually find the early adopters sleep in sleeping bags outside Apple stores. The first adapter is someone who, in their mind, notice what's missing in the field of play. That's not about positive thinking. It's like, what's missing in this field of play on this game board? They're the first to spot high leverage patterns that can create game-changing, game-winning decisions. So they're connecting the dots and they're being able to go, what is it that I'm after here? What is it that I'm trying to create? So it's the power is this intent to create as opposed to make nice. No one wants to prevent people aren't nice, but when making nice, sometimes it's, Oliver Mike calls it people please. They're just trying to please people and you end up not knowing what's really going on. You have to have what I refer to as sagacity, which is penetrating insight and sound judgment, this discernment to go right to what the issue is, to be able to coordinate and you cooperate with others, or you're prepared for dealing with the competitive design.
So I find it very interesting you're saying that these first adapters are people who are noticing what's not there, noticing the patterns, and then noticing what's not there. Talk to us a little bit, if you can, Stephen, about how we can begin to do that, because we're all reactive. Human beings are reactive. That's the natural stance. And as you said, even as Bradshaw said, normal isn't healthy. Normal's just whatever you got used to. So everything feels unfamiliar that's outside of that. So this event has happened. It feels unfamiliar. We're outside of our usual, quote, normal. Instead of going into the panic mode, which may even still happen for a moment or two, you then begin to look at what's the pattern here and what's missing that becomes potential opportunity. Walk us through a little bit about how to step into that mindset, step into that mental processing that, as you said, is power thinking.
So let me give you an example. I had a client who was an engineer, a director of engineering at a $4 billion company, big company, very competent guy, who told me he soaks in learning, loves to learn, loves to take new ideas. And his approach, whenever things didn't go well, was he would say, so the problem is, and he'd begin to talk, he's an engineer, solves problems. It would seem to make sense. And he'd go to the executives and say, so the problem is X, Y, and Z. And the next time he'd say, so the problem is A, B, and C. And he had no idea that his pattern of always announcing what the problem was He thought, that's my job, to solve problems. When I was talking to him initially, I said, do you realize that in the first 15 minutes you said, so the problem is like 6 times? And I said, do you have any idea how the executives are perceiving you? He went, they see me as a problem solver. I'm solving problems. Well, here's the thing. His senior vice president wanted to give him a promotion because he's extremely competent, capable, brought people along tremendously. And the executives wanted to fire him. And so why did they want to fire him? Because they saw him as a problem maker. Because he'd always bring up his whole message. His whole brand was, and so the problem is, and they felt that they were getting attacked. They're getting criticized. We're getting judged. Their brain starts shutting down. He thinks the problems are his brain starts shutting down. All this uncertainty of what's going on. And so part of what I did was found a way for him to begin his sentences without, so the problem is. And when I told him that, he was shocked. He went, I thought I was trying to be helpful. I had no idea, but his own source code, as you would say, was to be solving these problems and dismiss the emotional effect. So he was creating all this judgment in those meetings and shutting down their brains and saying, hey, we don't need this guy. Let's go over to someone else. So once he found a way, and we talked about how he could say, hey, listen, you guys, we're working really hard. You guys are figuring these things out. These are really troublesome. These are difficult times. I really appreciate how much what we're doing. Here's our resources. We need help on this. What can we do to make that happen? We're in it to win it. Instead of all these guys saying, fire him, they said, okay, he's promoted. Just as an example of that, understanding some of the different ways of approaching that, his attempted solution was the problem.
I think that most people who are in the solution business have to identify a problem first. And oftentimes people don't want to hear that they're possibly part of that problem. So even phrasing it that way would be very challenging to hear. I can hear that now.
Look, we're running a $4 billion company. We must be doing something right. Who's this guy to come along and tell us the problem is you got? He was right, by the way. He's a wonderful guy. And he was right. He was like, oh, I can't believe it. So what we did was give him some powerful thinking, penetrating insight to question his approach, to be able to go behind the scenes. What is the effect? Is the game out? What's the effect of your saying and the problem is?
So from that point of view, the pattern that needed to be recognized was he was saying the problem is. That's wonderful. So that's the pattern. What was missing? Was it simply his own awareness of his own language pattern?
Yes. What was missing was he couldn't see himself. He had a concept. The rule in his head was solve problems.
So often the challenge is, for many leaders, this is why you and I get hired, is that people think that they can see themselves and none of us can see ourselves. None of us is objective in our subjective reality. And having somebody like you who can step in and say, hold on a second, have you considered this? Makes that, we talked about before, my favorite book title is by a gentleman called Moshe Feldenkrais, and his book was called The Elusive Obvious. One of my favorite titles of any book ever, because it's elusive, but it's so obvious, but it's only elusive to you. And having somebody like Steven Feinberg or Dov Baron or somebody else step in and go, it's glaring to us, and we can help you cut out a ton of pain and time by just getting to that. And that's what you mean by that power thinking, because in that process, that person doesn't just have a single strategy, they have a level of awareness about themselves that is transformative moving forward. Is that correct?
Yes. And so if you think about, there's one thing that causes leadership failure, entrepreneurial failure, relationship failure. And that one thing is the hidden rule, the rules book that you operate with, the internal rule book. And that rule book is, there's rules for how to play on the game board, and there's rules for how to feel. And those two rule books are central to whether or not you're going to excel.
I want to dive into those rule books in part 2 of the show so we can help people to understand how to find their own rule book and look at how it's impacting positively or negatively their relationships and their business. But before we do that, we're coming towards the end of part 1 of the show. I want to make sure that people know how to find out more about you, Stephen. So please tell people how they can find out about you, about your book, and about all your resources.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. So I'm having a great time, by the way. This is a great time because you're so stimulating in your questions and engagement. people can reach me. They can go to my website, Stephen@StephenFeinberg.com or StephenFeinberg.com, or they can reach me actually personally. They can send me an email at Stephen@StephenFeinberg.com, and Stephen is Steven. Feinberg is F as in family, EIN as in Nancy, B as in boy, ERG.com. You can find my book, Do What Others Say Can't Be Done, at Amazon. And the first book was called The Advantage Makers as well. Both those books are available. And by the way, if you go to my website, StephenFeinberg.com, there's an assessment instrument for first adapters. You could compare yourself to the greatest first adapters.
Beautiful. I'm going to make sure that we put all those links into the show notes. So if for some reason you didn't catch them, don't worry. Just go into the show notes. They'll be right there for you. We're going to be back in just one click with a man who knows how to master the meta game of your life and of your business so that you can do what others say can't be done. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Dr. Stephen Feinberg. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. See you in part 2.